They did not whisper when the carriage stopped. They stared. Every soul assembled before the iron gates of St. Aldwyn's Church stood perfectly still, as though the cold October wind had turned them to stone. The women gripped their gloves. The men straightened their hats. And not one of them said a word, because none of them needed to. Their eyes said everything that propriety forbade their lips from uttering. A bride stood on the stone steps. She was pale as winter frost, and lovely in the way that grief sometimes makes a person lovely. Quietly, painfully, without intention. Her white silk gown was modest, high at the neck, long at the sleeve, with delicate lace running along the bodice in the manner of a gentlewoman of proper upbringing. Her dark hair had been pinned and dressed beneath a thin veil, and she held a small bouquet of pale cream roses so tightly that her gloved knuckles had gone white. Her name was Winifred Shepherd. She was 23 years of age, and she was crying. Not loudly, not with any of the dramatic wailing that lesser novels would supply a woman in such a moment. Winifred Shepherd wept the way she had always done everything. Quietly, carefully, with her chin lifted so that no one might observe the full extent of her anguish. 2 tears had traced silent paths down her cheeks, and she had not wiped them away, because to do so would have required her to move, and she was not certain, in that moment, that she was capable of movement at all. Beside her, seated in a worn wooden wheelchair, was the man she had just been bound to in the eyes of God and the law of England. A stranger. He was dressed plainly, a grey wool coat somewhat too large for his frame, dark trousers that had seen better seasons, and boots that had walked many miles across hard roads. His jaw was set with a composure that struck one as either stupidity or remarkable self-possession, and his eyes, those still watchful grey eyes, looked neither at the crowd nor at the weeping woman beside him, but at some fixed point in the middle distance, as though he were solving a quiet equation that no one else could see. They called him Arnold. That was all anyone knew. Arnold. A cripple. A beggar who had once sat at the corner of Millhaven Lane, cap in hand, in the cold grey mornings of early autumn. A man without estate, without family, without any visible claim to dignity in the rigid arithmetic of Victorian society. And standing behind them both was perfectly consist in a gown of deep crimson silk with fine lace at the collar and pearls at her throat, was Lady Millicent Shepherd, Winifred's stepmother. She was smiling. In her right hand she held a document, folded, official, sealed with black wax. A marriage contract. She held it the way a woman holds a winning card at the end of a very long game, with pleasure that she had chosen not to conceal. No one intervened. Not the vicar, who had already spoken the words and closed his book. Not the witnesses who stared at the cobblestones. Not Benjamin Shepherd, Winifred's father, who stood some distance back from the group with his hat in his hands and his gaze fixed low, as a man does when he knows he has failed someone irrevocably. The wind moved through the churchyard. A rook called from the elm beyond the gate, and Winifred Shepherd stood there on those cold stone steps, married to a crippled beggar with no understanding whatsoever of what had truly just begun. For what none of them knew, not the silent crowd, not Lady Millicent in her crimson triumph, not even Winifred herself, was that the man in the wheelchair was not a beggar. He had never been a beggar. His name was not Arnold. His name was Lawrence Pembroke, His Grace, the Duke of Blackmere. If you have ever watched someone be underestimated, if you have ever been that someone, then stay exactly where you are. This story was written for you. Subscribe now, turn on the bell, and let us begin. Now let's get back to the story. Thank you. To understand what happened on those church steps, one must first understand Winifred Shepherd's life before them. The house on Carrow Street had once been a warm house. Winifred could still remember, if she tried very hard and closed her eyes, what it had felt like when her mother lived there. The smell of dried lavender in the linens, the sound of a pianoforte being played in the evening, the particular quality of light in the parlour when the curtains were left open. Her mother, Eleanor Shepherd, had possessed the kind of quiet grace that fills a house the way sunlight fills a room, not noticed until it is gone. Eleanor died in the spring of 1882. Winifred was 12 years old. She did not weep at the funeral. She had wept privately, in her bedroom the night before, until her pillow was damp and her throat ached. By the morning of the burial, she had no more tears to give. And so she stood beside her father in the churchyard, with a dry face, and her hands folded. And the rector spoke about mercy and the hereafter, and Winifred listened to every word, and believed none of it offered her any comfort. Her father, Benjamin Shepherd, was a solicitor of moderate reputation and insufficient backbone. He was not a cruel man. He was something perhaps worse. A man of great feeling and no courage, who responded to difficulty by turning his face from it, and to grief by seeking relief as quickly as social custom permitted. He remarried within 14 months. The second Mrs. Shepherd, Lady Millicent, formerly of the Greystone family of Dorset, arrived at the house on Carrow Street with 2 trunks of fine clothing, a very clear idea of her own consequence, and no intention whatsoever of allowing a 12-year-old girl to inconvenience her. She was not violent. Winifred would have found violence easier to name and resist. Lady Millicent's methods were quieter than violence, and considerably more effective. She was a woman of small cruelties, administered with great patience, the withheld approval, the rearranged room, the dismissive turn of the head, the remark delivered in company that left Winifred unable to respond without appearing ungrateful. The books were the first to go. Winifred had always read. Her mother had encouraged it, had taken her to the lending library on Thursdays, and allowed her to choose without guidance. By the time she was 12, Winifred had worked through histories, natural philosophy, botanical studies, and a small collection of legal texts that had belonged to her grandfather. She had been particularly drawn to the legal volumes, not because she understood them fully, but because their precision fascinated her, the way language in the law was made to do exact and consequential work. Lady Millicent did not forbid the books outright. She simply had them boxed and placed in the upper storeroom, explaining to Benjamin that a young woman filling her head with such material was forming unladylike ideas. Benjamin had nodded and said nothing, as was his habit. Winifred climbed to the storeroom that evening and retrieved a volume on English property law. She kept it under the mattress for 3 years. By the time she was 18, Lady Millicent had effectively redesigned Winifred's existence into something resembling a household position. She managed the linen accounts, supervised the cook's weekly orders, received guests with appropriate courtesy, and was otherwise expected to occupy herself with needlework and the pianoforte, which she played competently and without passion. She was permitted no correspondence of her own. No calling cards were printed in her name. No gentleman came to call, because Lady Millicent always managed, with a smooth word here and a well-timed social engagement there, to ensure that no particular connection developed far enough to become inconvenient. Winifred understood this in the way one understands the architecture of a trap only after it has already closed. She saw it clearly. She simply did not, for a long time, know what to do about it. Catherine, the parlour maid, was the only person in the house who spoke to Winifred as though she mattered. She was a practical young woman of 25 with red hands and a kind mouth, and she had a habit of leaving a warm cup of tea outside Winifred's door on cold evenings without ever mentioning it. They never spoke of important things directly, but Catherine knew, and Winifred knew that Catherine knew, and that was, for many years, sufficient. "You have your mother's eyes," Catherine said once, passing Winifred in the corridor. "She always looked as though she were working something out." "Perhaps I am," Winifred replied. She was working out how to survive Lady Millicent. And then in the autumn of her 23rd year, Lady Millicent grew tired of waiting for Winifred to disappear of her own accord and decided to arrange it herself. The first Winifred heard of Arnold was in September of 1883. She had been in the morning room, ostensibly arranging flowers, actually reading the property law volume she had long since committed to memory, but still returned to for the reassurance of familiar argument. She heard Lady Millicent's voice in the hallway below, low, deliberate, the tone she used when conducting business she did not wish overheard. Winifred did not move. She listened. The other voice was Godfrey's. Godfrey served as a kind of occasional agent for Lady Millicent, a thin, angular man in a brown coat who appeared at the house perhaps once a month and departed swiftly, usually with an envelope of some kind, exchanged at the door. Winifred had never trusted him, though she could not have articulated precisely why, beyond the way his eyes moved when he spoke, as though checking continuously to ensure his words had landed correctly. "The contract is prepared," Godfrey said. "His compliance is secured." "And the witnesses?" Lady Millicent's voice. "Arranged. The vicar has been spoken to. A small consideration was sufficient." "And she will have no means to contest it afterward?" A pause. "Under the Married Women's Property Act of last year, she would retain her personal property, but without independent income or legal counsel, the practical ability to—" "That is not what I asked. No, she will have no practical means to contest it." Lady Millicent said, "Good." And Winifred heard the sound of the front door, and then her stepmother's footsteps retreating toward the drawing room. Winifred sat very still with the book open in her lap, and understood, with a cold and total clarity, that something was being arranged for her. Something she had not been consulted about. Something that would change everything. She pressed her hand flat against the page of the legal text, and made herself a promise, in the quiet of that morning room, that she did not yet know how to keep. She promised herself that this was not the end of her story. That whatever Lady Millicent was arranging, it would not be the final word on the subject of Winifred Shepherd's life. She did not know, sitting there, how extraordinary that promise would prove. Millhaven Lane was not the sort of street that anyone of consequence had reason to visit. It ran between the back of a tannery and the side wall of a chandler's warehouse, and it smelled accordingly, of leather and tallow and the particular exhaustion of working London. The cobblestones were uneven. The gas lamp at the far end had been broken since February. But every morning from 7 o'clock until the light began to fail, there was a man at the corner. He sat in a wooden wheelchair that looked as though it had been patched together from 2 different chairs and considerable determination. He wore a grey coat and a plain brown cap pulled low, and he had a tin cup in his hand, into which, occasionally, a passer-by would drop a coin. Not because they looked at him, but because people in a hurry find it easier to give a coin than to meet a man's eyes. He called himself Arnold. No surname. He offered none and was asked for none, because beggars on Millhaven Lane were not in the habit of formal introduction. Winifred came upon him on a Thursday in late September, 3 days after she had overheard the conversation in the hallway. She had been sent by Lady Millicent on an errand to the chemist's on the next street, a minor errand, probably contrived, and she had taken the long way back because she was not ready to return to the house on Carrow Street, and she needed air and the particular kind of solitude one can only find in a crowd. She would have passed him without stopping. She passed the same sorts of figures every time she came this way, and had learned, as all Londoners learn, to look through rather than at them. But something about this particular man, made her stop. He was reading, not a pamphlet, not a cheap sheet. He was reading what appeared to be a very small, very old volume with a dark green cover, holding it close to his eyes in the grey morning light. And his expression as he read was one of such complete absorption that the rest of the lane, the noise, the smell, the passing feet, appeared simply not to exist for him. Winifred stood and watched him for a moment. Then she said, before she had quite decided to say anything at all, "What are you reading?" He looked up. Those grey eyes focused on her with a directness that was not rude, but was not tentative either, the gaze of a man accustomed to seeing clearly. "Blackstone," he said, "Commentaries on the Laws of England." She stared at him. "On Volume 2, he added, with the merest suggestion of something that was not quite a smile. "Property." "You are reading Blackstone," she said, "on Millhaven Lane." "I find it clarifies the mind," he said. "And Millhaven Lane offers very few competing distractions." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "I have the first volume. I have had it for 11 years under my mattress." This time he did look at her with something approaching genuine interest. "Under your mattress," he said. "It was the safest place I could think of," she said. He considered this. "A sensible arrangement," he said. And then a man with a cart came through, and Winifred stepped aside, and by the time the cart had passed, she had decided she had already said considerably more to a stranger on the street than was proper, and she wished him a good morning, and walked on. She thought about him for the rest of the day, not in any romantic fashion, or at least not in any fashion she would have admitted to herself at the time. She thought about the book. She thought about the way he had said property as though the word had weight. She thought about the quality of his voice, educated, careful, entirely inconsistent with the tin cup and the patched wheelchair and the corner of Millhaven Lane. She returned on Saturday. She did not plan to. She told herself she was going to the market 2 streets further on, which was true, and that her route simply happened to take her past the corner, which was a sufficient lie to make herself comfortable. He was there. "You came back," he said, not looking up immediately from the book. "I was going to the market," she said. "The market," he agreed, still reading. She sat down on the low wall opposite him, which was itself an act of small rebellion, since a gentlewoman did not sit on walls in public, and said, "I want to ask you something, and I would prefer you answer it honestly." "I have found honesty generally the more efficient policy," he said, and set the book in his lap. "You speak like an educated man," she said. "Your speech, your reading, it does not match this corner." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "Many things in this world do not match their corners," he said. "I find it instructive rather than troubling." "That is not an answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." She waited. "I am precisely what you see," he said at last, and the words were so carefully chosen that she understood immediately that they were true, and simultaneously that they were not the full truth, and that he knew she understood both things, and that they had somehow, in the space of 2 brief conversations on a disreputable lane, arrived at a perfect mutual understanding of the situation, without either of them having said anything sufficiently specific to be held to. She went to the market. She came back the same way. He was still there, reading. She did not stop again, but he looked up as she passed, and she gave the briefest inclination of her head, and he gave the same. And that was all. It was, in retrospect, the most honest exchange Winifred Shepherd had had with anyone in years. Lady Millicent summoned Winifred to the drawing-room on a Tuesday evening in early October, which was unusual. She did not typically summon Winifred. She gave instructions in passing. At breakfast, in the corridor, through Catherine. A formal summons meant something formal was to be communicated. Winifred entered the drawing room and found Lady Millicent seated in the high-backed chair by the fire, with Benjamin Shepherd on the sofa beside her, his hat in his hands, his eyes on the carpet. This was also unusual. Benjamin was rarely included in Lady Millicent's proceedings. His presence typically indicated that a decision had been made, and she required his visible endorsement of it. "Sit down, Winifred," Lady Millicent said. Winifred sat. "I have arranged a marriage for you." The fire crackled. Benjamin's fingers tightened on his hat. Winifred said nothing for a moment. She was thinking of the conversation she had overheard. She was thinking of Godfrey and the envelope and the word compliance. She said, "I see. May I know who the gentleman is?" "His name is Arnold," Lady Millicent said. "He is a man of humble circumstances. The wedding will take place at St. Aldwyn's on the 14th. "The 14th, Winifred repeated. "That is 12 days from now." "12 days is quite sufficient." "Father." Winifred turned to Benjamin. Benjamin Shepherd looked up. His face wore the expression of a man who has told himself a sufficiently convincing story to avoid examining his own conscience. "It is a secure arrangement," he said. "Lady Millicent has ensured the contract is legally binding and that you will be provided for." "Provided for," Winifred said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. She had loved her father once, as with the uncomplicated certainty of a child. That love had not entirely departed. It had simply become something quieter and sadder, the way a garden becomes when it is no longer tended. "I should like to see the contract," she said. Lady Millicent's expression shifted very slightly. "There is no reason for you to—" "Under the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, Winifred said, keeping her voice entirely level. "I retain the right to my own property, subsequent to marriage. I should like to review what has been stipulated regarding financial provision, maintenance, and the disposition of any property held in my name." A silence. The fire popped. Lady Millicent recovered herself admirably. "You have been reading again?" she said. "I'm always reading," Winifred said. The contract was not shown to her, so she had not genuinely expected it to be. She had made the request because she wished Lady Millicent to know that she was not entirely ignorant, and because she suspected it would make her stepmother slightly less comfortable than before. And in her current situation, she took satisfaction where she could find it. She returned to her room and sat at the window for a long time, watching the street below. In England, in 1883, a woman of Winifred's age and circumstances had very few practical means of refusing a marriage arranged under legal guardianship by someone with her father's cooperation and a signed contract. The Married Women's Property Act was new and imperfect. Women could not yet vote. They could not be called to the bar. They could hold property in their own names, a recent and hard-won thing. But their freedom of movement, or of choice of legal self-determination, remained tightly bounded. Winifred understood all of this. She had been reading about it, quietly and systematically, since she was 12 years old. She also understood that Lady Millicent's objective was not primarily her well-being. Winifred had recently turned 23. Benjamin Shepherd, though no one had said so explicitly, was in poor health, if he died without having disposed of Winifred. She would have legal claims on the estate that might complicate Lady Millicent's position considerably. Better, from Lady Millicent's perspective, to have Winifred married off and effectively removed from the board. A crippled beggar was an ideal candidate. He would make no social claims. His wife would be beyond the pale of respectable society, and the whole arrangement could be accomplished quietly with minimal inconvenience. Winifred sat with all of this knowledge arranged clearly in her mind, like pieces on a chessboard. Then she thought about a man on Millhaven Lane reading Blackstone. She thought about grey eyes and the word property, and the careful way he had said, "I am precisely what you see," and the way she had understood, with absolute certainty, that those words had more than one layer to them. She slept very little that night, but when she did sleep, she dreamed, not of despair, but of a very large house and a great many books and rooms she had not yet been inside. The morning of the 14th was cold and overcast, the sky the particular shade of grey that October reserves for occasions that do not deserve sunlight. Winifred, dressed without assistance, as Catherine had offered, had stood at the door with her red hands folded and her mouth pressed together in a line that expressed everything she was not able to say. But Winifred had shaken her head and thanked her, and closed the door gently, and dressed herself in the white silk gown that Lady Millicent had selected, and that Winifred had had altered, very slightly, to sit higher at the neck and longer at the sleeve. Small acts of self-possession were the only kind available to her, and she took them where she could. She did her own hair. She pinned her mother's cameo at her collar. She picked up the cream roses that had been left in a paper from the florist, arranged them in her gloved hands, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. The woman who looked back was pale and composed, and entirely unlike the woman she felt herself to be internally, which was frightened and furious in approximately equal measure. "Good," she said to the mirror, and went downstairs. The carriage to St. Aldwyn's took 20 minutes. Lady Millicent sat opposite with the marriage contract in her lap, smoothing it once with the flat of her hand in a gesture that was almost affectionate. Benjamin sat beside Winifred and said nothing. His breath smelled of brandy, which he normally did not drink before noon. The church was small. The gathering was small. Thus there were perhaps 15 people in the yard. Neighbours, a couple of acquaintances, 2 individuals Winifred did not recognize, who were later identified to her as the contracted witnesses. Godfrey stood near the gate with his hands behind his back. And in the centre of the churchyard, on the cold, flat stones before the doors, was Arnold. He was dressed as she had seen him on Millhaven Lane. The grey coat, the plain trousers, with the single addition of a white buttonhole, a small waxy gardenia that someone had pinned to his lapel. He sat in his wheelchair with his hands resting on his knees and his gaze on the middle distance, and he did not look at Winifred when she approached, which she found both insulting and, upon reflection, something approaching kind. Oh, the vicar conducted the ceremony in the brisk manner of a man who has been paid to perform a duty and is performing it without commentary. Winifred said the words she was required to say. Her voice did not shake. She had decided the night before that her voice would not shake, and it did not. Arnold said the words he was required to say in a voice that were quiet and entirely steady. When the vicar pronounced them married, Lady Millicent made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. She covered it quickly with her gloved hand, but Winifred heard it, and she suspected everyone present heard it, and she felt the humiliation of it settle somewhere deep in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The crowd stared. What Winifred stood on the church steps with her cream roses and her mother's cameo and her carefully maintained composure, and she allowed them to stare, because there was nothing else to be done, and she had decided that she would not give any of them, not the witnesses, not the neighbours, not Lady Millicent with her marriage contract and her barely concealed triumph, the satisfaction of watching her collapse. She looked straight ahead. After a moment, she became aware that Arnold was looking at her. She did not turn to look at him directly, but from the corner of her eye she could see that his gaze had shifted from the middle distance and was now fixed on her face, and his expression, which she caught only briefly, only obliquely, was not the expression of a man who had just participated in a humiliation. It was something else entirely. Something that looked, if she had to name it, almost like apology. A carriage was brought. Lady Millicent stepped forward, pressed the marriage contract into Winifred's hands, and said very quietly, "You are no longer my concern." Then she turned and walked back toward the shepherd carriage without looking back. Benjamin did not move for a moment. Then he took a step toward his daughter and stopped again, and Winifred watched him choose, in that hesitation, the path of least resistance, as he had always chosen it. He turned. He followed Lady Millicent. Winifred looked at the marriage contract in her hands. Then she looked at Arnold. "I assume," she said, in a voice that was very controlled, "that there is a destination." "There is," he said, "if you are willing." "I appear," she said, "to have very little alternative." He looked at her steadily. "I am sorry," he said, "for this." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She folded the contract and placed it in her coat pocket and allowed Chambers, a broad, quiet man in a dark coat, who appeared from somewhere behind the carriage, as though he had been there all along, to assist her inside. Arnold's wheelchair was loaded by a second figure she did not recognize, and they drove away from St. Aldwyn's Church into the grey October afternoon. Neither of them spoke. The roses were still in her hands. She had not put them down once during the entire ceremony. She looked at them now. Real roses, properly fragrant, the kind that cost considerably more than a man who begged on Millhaven Lane could reasonably have afforded. She filed the observation away carefully, alongside everything else. The carriage travelled for nearly 2 hours. Winifred watched London dissolve into the outer edges of itself. The narrowing streets giving way to wider roads, the dense terraces opening into fields, the gas lamps becoming scarcer and then absent entirely, replaced by the pale winter sky and the flat, wide horizon of the English countryside in late autumn. The trees had mostly shed their leaves. The fields were brown and quietly resting. A flock of rooks crossed the sky above a ridge of distant elms. Chambers sat on the box with the driver. Inside the carriage, it was only Winifred and Arnold, and Winifred was acutely, physically aware of that fact, in the way that one is aware of a fire one is sitting too close to. She kept her eyes on the window. "After perhaps 40 minutes," he said, "you may ask me things if you wish." "I have a great many questions," she said. "I expect so. I shall begin with the simplest one." She looked at him. "Where are we going?" "An estate," he said. "In Derbyshire, some distance yet." "An estate," she repeated. "Belonging to." "It belongs to my family," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Your family," she said. "A beggar's family." "That word has been applied to me, yes." "You are not going to tell me anything else," she said. "Not yet," he said, "but I will. In time. I give you my word on that." "Your word," she said. The word had a sharp edge to it that she had not intended to put there, but once it was there, she did not take it away. He heard it. She could see that he heard it. He did not flinch from it. "My word," he said again, simply. "So such as it is. I understand if you find it insufficient." "I find most things in my current situation insufficient," she said. "But I am here regardless, so we might as well proceed." She returned to the window. She was examining, internally, the several things that had already struck her as inconsistent with the story she had been given. The roses had been the first. The carriage was the second. It was a well-maintained vehicle, with good horses and an experienced driver, not the sort of arrangement a man of no means could produce. Chambers was the third. He was not the shambling attendant of a charity case, but a composed, or quietly assured man who had handled the wheelchair and the carriage door and the logistics of the journey with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this sort of thing many times and knew exactly what he was about. And there was the fourth thing. When they had left the churchyard, when the carriage door had been closed and the horses had set off, she had caught, briefly, fleetingly, the expression on Chambers' face as he looked at Arnold through the carriage window. It was not the expression of a servant looking at his employer. It was the expression of a man looking at someone he respected and was worried about. A look of protectiveness, of loyalty. The landscape changed as they moved further north. The land became more dramatic, ridges rising on either side, the sky opening wider, the villages smaller and further spaced. Old Winifred had never been to Derbyshire. She had read about it. She had read about everything. But reading is a different country than seeing. The late afternoon light was beginning to thin when the carriage turned between two stone pillars onto a long approach road that wound upward through bare-branched trees. Winifred sat forward. At the end of the road, on a rise above a deep valley, was a house. A great house. Stone, 3 stories, with a long facade and rows of tall windows and a central portico under which the carriage now drew. Gardens had been laid out below the terrace, brown and sleeping in October, but clearly extensive. Chimney smoke rose from several stacks. Lights were beginning to appear in the lower windows. Winifred stared. She said nothing. The carriage stopped. Chambers appeared at the door. "Oh, welcome to Blackmere," he said. The interior of Blackmere was everything the exterior had promised. She was shown to rooms that were large and warm, and furnished with the quiet authority of old money. Good wood, deep carpets, curtains of heavy damask in a dark gold. A fire had been laid. Hot water had been sent. A supper tray appeared before she had thought to ask for one. The household staff she encountered in that first hour were correct and courteous in the way of well-trained servants, not servile, not familiar, but possessed of a steady efficiency that spoke of long practice and good management. They showed her to her rooms. They answered her questions briefly and precisely. They disappeared when they were not required. It was only later, lying in the dark and listening to the old house settle around her, that Winifred began to catalogue the strangeness of it all. It was too large a house for a man of Arnold's apparent circumstances. It was too well staffed. The rooms were not merely adequate, they were gracious. The supper tray had contained things, a particular sauce, a French pastry, that required both resources and a cook of genuine skill. The linen was monogrammed. She sat up and lit the candle beside the bed and looked at the monogram. LP. She stared at it for a very long time. In the morning, she rose early and dressed and went downstairs before most of the household was stirring. She had always been an early riser. It was the only time in the house on Carrow Street when she could move through the rooms without encountering Lady Millicent, and the habit had stayed with her. She found the library on the ground floor, at which was exactly where she would have placed it if she were building a house, and she went in. It was the finest room she had ever stood in. 3 walls of books, floor to ceiling, on dark oak shelves, a pair of reading tables, leather chairs before the fireplace, and the books themselves, hundreds, perhaps thousands, arranged with the careful organization of a working collection rather than a decorative one. She ran her fingers along the spines, reading titles. Law, history, natural philosophy, classical languages, land management, parliamentary procedure, architecture, medicine. She pulled a volume from the shelf at random. It was an annotated edition of Coke upon Littleton, the marginalia dense and written in a small, precise hand. She was still reading when her husband, appeared in the doorway. He was in his wheelchair. He wore a dark green morning coat and looked somewhat more composed than he had in the grey streetlight of Millhaven Lane, which she noted and filed away. "You found the library," he said. "It was inevitable," she said, without looking up. "Were you hoping I would not?" "On the contrary, I was rather counting on it." She looked up at that. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something careful, assessing, and, she would have sworn, anxious. not the anxiety of guilt, the anxiety of a man waiting for a verdict. "Coke upon Littleton," she said, holding up the volume, "with annotations. A careful reader," he said. "Who annotated it?" "I did." She looked at him. She looked at the annotations. She looked at him again. She said, very quietly, "Who are you?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at the shelves around them, at the thousands of books that bore his annotations, his monogram, his history. "Thus, I have asked myself that question considerably more than you might expect," he said. "I shall answer it properly, soon. I give you my word." "You gave me your word yesterday," she said. "Yes," he said, "and I have not broken it." She considered this. Then she turned back to the book, because she was not ready to stop reading it, and he stayed in the doorway for another moment, and then withdrew, and she heard his wheelchair on the corridor beyond, and then silence. She met Augusta Pembroke at luncheon. The older woman was already seated at the head of the long dining table when Winifred was shown in, seated with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to women who have spent decades commanding large rooms without raising their voices. She was perhaps 60, handsome in the way of good bone structure that does not surrender to age, dressed in deep violet with jet mourning jewelry that was too fine to be recent loss and too present to be entirely historical. She looked at Winifred with frank, intelligent eyes. "Sit down, child," she said, in a tone that was not unkind, but was not tentative. Winifred sat. "You have been in the library," Augusta said. "Yes." "Good." She unfolded her napkin with a precise gesture. "My son has told me something of your circumstances. Not everything, but enough." Winifred felt the word son land in her chest like a stone. "Your son," she said. "Yes." Augusta looked at her steadily. "His name is Lawrence. The rest of his name I expect he will share with you himself, in his own time, which is irritating, but is the way of him, and always has been." She lifted her glass. "I should tell you that I did not approve of this particular stratagem. I made my disapproval known at some length. However, I have come to understand his reasoning even where I disagree with his methods, and I believe, whatever the circumstances of your arrival here, that you are not who your stepmother intended to send." Winifred looked at her. What did she intend to send? "A defeated woman," Augusta said simply. "Someone who had already given up. I do not believe that is what she has sent." Winifred was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No, it is not." Augusta Pembroke looked at her son's wife across the table and said, "No, I thought not." And there was, for the first time, something in her expression that might have been relief. Now Lara Lloyd appeared at the doorway then, a young woman of Winifred's age, in the plain, dark dress of an upper household servant, carrying a soup tureen. She had a quick, attentive face, and the sort of manner that suggested she listened to conversations carefully and remembered them accurately. Winifred noticed her, the way she had always noticed useful things. "Lara," Augusta said, "you will attend to Mrs." She paused almost imperceptibly. "To our guest. She is to have whatever she requires." "Yes, ma'am," Lara said. She looked at Winifred briefly, and her expression was guarded but not unkind. The soup was excellent. The bread was warm. Outside the dining room windows, the Derbyshire hills rolled away into the afternoon. Winifred ate and thought and thought and ate, and by the time the meal was finished, she had formed a working hypothesis about the identity of the man who called himself Arnold. She did not yet have all the evidence she required. But she was, she reflected, beginning to assemble it. It happened on the 5th day. Not because he was ready, or rather, not only because he was ready, because Winifred had been reading the household accounts, not secretly. She had asked Chambers for them directly, explaining that she wished to understand the estate's management, and Chambers had looked at her for a long moment with that particular expression of careful assessment, and then had brought them without demur. She had spent 2 days with the ledgers, and had worked out, with a precision that made her feel both proud and vaguely cold, was that Blackmere Estate ran on an income of approximately £12,000 per annum, that it employed 47 indoor and outdoor staff, that it held agricultural tenancies across 300 acres, and that its legal and financial affairs were administered by a London firm called Pembroke and Aldgate. She was in the library when she set down the ledger and said, to the empty room, "Pembroke," and the door opened and he came in. He was not in the wheelchair. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame, standing fully on his own 2 feet, in a dark coat and good boots, his posture that of a man who has spent his entire life in rooms that belonged to him. He was taller than she had imagined. That was her first thought, which she recognized immediately as a ridiculous thing to think under the circumstances. Oh, he looked at her. She looked at him. Augusta Pembroke appeared behind him in the corridor, and Godfrey, looking considerably less comfortable than usual, and Chambers, whose expression was unreadable, but whose hands were very still. "Winifred," he said. "Lawrence," she said. He made a very slight, involuntary movement. A breath, or the beginning of something. You already knew. "I had sufficient evidence to form a conclusion," she said. "The monogram, the annotations, the income of 12,000 per annum. The name of your solicitors." She paused. "You are Lawrence Pembroke, His Grace, the Duke of Blackmere." The room was very quiet. "Yes," he said. She stood up from the reading chair and clasped her hands in front of her, which was not a gesture of nervousness, but of decision. "Then I should very much like an explanation," she said, "a complete one, without omissions, and I should like you to sit down for it, because I find I am somewhat less able to maintain my composure if you are standing in a doorway, and I am sitting, which creates a positional disadvantage I find irritating." He came in. He sat. He explained. The full account took the better part of an hour, and Winifred did not interrupt it, which cost her considerably, because she had a great many questions, and her nature was to ask them immediately. But she recognized, listening to him, that the story he was telling required to be told whole, and so she listened whole. Lawrence Pembroke was 31 years old, the sole surviving son of the late Duke of Blackmere, and he had inherited the dukedom at the age of 26 upon his father's death. The title and estate were clear enough. What had not been clear was the characters of the people who depended upon him, the estate managers, the legal representatives, the extended family members with claims and interests and agendas, and what was not clear was whether those people were loyal to him or to his father's money. "My father was not a careful man," he said, and said it simply, without self-pity. "He was generous, and he was trusting, and several people took extraordinary advantage of both qualities during the last years of his health. When I inherited, I had strong reason to believe that certain people in the network around the estate were managing affairs in their own interest rather than the estate's. But I lacked proof, and in the absence of proof, any action I took would have been contested, probably in chancery. For years." "So you put on a different coat," Winifred said. "I put on a different life," he said. "Chambers was the only person in the household who knew. Godfrey," a slight pause, "was among those I suspected. The purpose of the exercise on Millhaven Lane was to place myself in a position where I could observe people's conduct when they believed I had no power, no presence, and no ability to hold them to account." "A social test," she said. "A moral test," he corrected. "There is a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "And my stepmother's arrangement?" she said. "She thought she was marrying me to a beggar." "Yes." She approached Godfrey, with whom she had apparently some prior acquaintance, and contracted to have a marriage arranged. The terms suited her purposes and appeared to suit the beggars. He looked at her steadily. She did not know who the beggar was. Godfrey, I suspect, was beginning to suspect the truth, which is one of the reasons I decided the time for the arrangement to conclude had arrived. "You could have told me," she said. The words had a particular quality, not accusation, not entirely, something between accusation and a question. "Yes," he said, "I could have. I did not, because—" He stopped. He looked at the shelves of books behind her. "Because I did not know you, and the entire purpose of the exercise was to learn what people were like when they believed no advantage was to be gained from goodness. You could not have been a fair test if you had known the result." Winifred considered this for a long time. She walked to the window. She stood looking out at the Derbyshire hills, which were grey and enormous and entirely indifferent to the drama being conducted in the library below them. "I read Blackstone," she said, "under my mattress, for 11 years. "I know," he said. "You told me, on Millhaven Lane. And you did not contrive my being there." "No. That was entirely circumstance." He paused. "There are moments, I think, when circumstance does the work more elegantly than strategy." She turned from the window and looked at him. This man who was her husband, this duke who had sat on a street corner with a tin cup and Blackstone, this person who was considerably more complicated than any of the stories she had been told about him. She said, "I want to study law." He blinked. Yes, of course." "I am not finished." She folded her hands. "I want tutors. I want access to every legal text in this library. And I want to correspond with Lincoln's Inn about the question of female admission, which will be a long and difficult and probably unsuccessful correspondence for many years, but I intend to begin it regardless. I want Lara Lloyd to be assigned to me as a personal attendant with appropriate compensation, because I observed that she listens and remembers, and I find those qualities professionally useful. And I want—" She paused. "I want to know that you will not subsequently decide that having a wife who practices law is inconvenient, and arrange for that ambition to be managed in the same way that Lady Millicent managed my books." Lawrence Pembroke looked at his wife. He looked at the ledgers she had spent 2 days working through. He looked at her hands, which were folded with a composure that he now recognized. Having observed it on a street corner in October, as the posture of someone accustomed to maintaining themselves in conditions that would undo a lesser person. "I will not," he said. "I give you my word." "You have given me your word before," she said. "And I have kept it," he said. Another silence. The fire, the hills, the books. "Yes," she said, "you have." In Victorian England, the idea of a woman studying law was not simply unconventional. It was, in most quarters, considered absurd. The bar had never been called by a woman. The Inns of Court did not admit women. A female solicitor was as yet a legal impossibility, because the various statutes governing admission used the word person in the way that legislators had long understood it, which was to say, in the way that excluded half the human population. Winifred knew all of this. She had known it since she was 16. She began anyway. The first weeks at Blackmere passed in a pattern that she would later remember as one of the most precise satisfactions of her life. Mornings, the library, with whatever text she had assigned herself. Afternoons, a series of tutorials with Lawrence, who proved to be the most rigorous intellectual companion she had ever encountered, not because he possessed any formal qualification that she lacked, but because he had read everything, thought carefully about all of it, and had the particular kind of honesty in argument that did not permit either of them to win a point they had not earned. He did not argue with her for the pleasure of it. He argued with her because he took her thinking seriously, and he expected her to take it seriously too. She found this after the years of being managed and and managed, almost physically startling, like a window opened in a room that had been shut for too long. "You are wrong about this," he said once, a week into their tutorials, pushing a document across the table. She looked at it. She looked at her own notes. She looked at it again. "Yes," she said. "I am." "Do you know why?" "I made an assumption about the limitation period without reading the statute directly. I relied on a summary." She paused. "I shall not do that again." "No," he said. "I thought not." And he moved on to the next point. Lara Lloyd proved as useful as Winifred had assessed. She was the daughter of a schoolmaster from the Derbyshire village below the estate, well read for her situation, quick with numbers, and possessed of a practical efficiency that Winifred found deeply valuable. Within a fortnight of her reassignment to Winifred's service, she was also functioning as a research assistant, tracking down specific volumes, cross-referencing statutes, maintaining the correspondence file that Winifred had established with Lincoln's Inn. The correspondence with Lincoln's Inn was predictably unproductive in its immediate results. The secretary's reply was courteous and entirely firm. The admission of women was not a matter presently under consideration. Winifred read the letter twice, set it aside, and wrote another. "You intend to wear them down," Lara said. "I intend," Winifred said, "to ensure that when the question does arise, and it will arise, there is already a documented body of correspondence from a named individual requesting admission, evidence of consistent and serious engagement, on the record. Nothing in law happens quickly or without a trail." Lara looked at her. "You are going to be a formidable person," she said. "I am going to be a lawyer," Winifred said. "The formidable part is incidental." The weeks became months. The winter settled into Derbyshire with its full weight, and the estate was cut off by snow for nearly a fortnight in February, during which time Winifred worked through a treatise on equity that she had found on the third shelf of the east wall, and that proved to be the most absorbing thing she had read since Blackstone. Lawrence worked alongside her, not always on the same material. He had estate business, tenancy disputes, letters from London that required his attention, but they were often in the library at the same time, working in the same warm room, and she found his presence neither intrusive nor absent, but simply there, in the steady and reliable way that a fire in a cold house is simply there. She noticed during those weeks that he was not a simple man. She had known from the first that he was intelligent, but intelligence is not character, and character was what she found herself observing more closely as the weeks passed. He was patient with the tenants who came to discuss their grievances. He was honest with his estate manager to the point of bluntness, and then immediately constructive. He listened to Augusta with genuine attention, even when he disagreed, and he disagreed with her often and without apology. He was consistently kind to Lara Lloyd and to Catherine, who had written from the house on Carrow Street, a careful, warm letter that said nothing directly about anything and conveyed everything, and whom Winifred had subsequently engaged to come to Blackmere at an appropriate wage. He did not manage Winifred. He did not redirect her or soften her or suggest she might moderate her ambitions for the sake of social comfort. But he read her legal arguments and found the errors in them and told her where they were. He read the good ones and said they were good. When she was wrong, she was told so. When she was right, she was told so. It was in its way the most respectful thing anyone had ever done for her. They did not discuss their marriage explicitly. It was there, in the shared rooms, in the formal structure of address and introduction, in the way the household organized itself around the two of them. But they circled it carefully, each of them, the way one circles a fire that has not yet proved itself safe to approach. It was in March, on an evening when the snow had finally begun to withdraw, and the fields below the terrace were beginning to emerge in pale, tentative green, so that Winifred went downstairs after dinner and found him on the terrace in the cold air, coatless, looking at the valley. "You will be cold," she said, coming out beside him. "Yes," he said. She stood next to him, and they looked at the valley together, which was dark and large and very quiet. "I was afraid," he said after a time, "that you would despise me. For the deception." "Yes." She considered this honestly. "I was angry," she said, "for some time. I am still occasionally, in small ways." She looked at the valley. "But you did not invent the circumstances that made the deception possible. You did not invent Lady Millicent, or my father's weakness, or the law that gave them the power to do what they did." She paused. "You gave me Blackmere, and the library, and the letters to Lincoln's Inn, which they continue to ignore, but which I shall continue to write." He made a sound that was, she thought, a laugh, though it was very quiet. "Lawrence," she said. "Yes. I'm going to need considerably more time before this becomes anything other than a complicated arrangement between two reasonably well-suited people who happen to be sharing a house and a legal status." "I know," he said. "But," she said, and stopped. "But," he said. She looked at him. In the cold March air, with the valley below them and the stars just beginning, he was simply a man looking at her, not managing her, not assessing her, not waiting for her to become something more convenient. "But I think it will become something," she said. "Eventually. In time." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been told I am very patient." "By whom?" "By Chambers, who has worked for me for 14 years and therefore has grounds for an opinion." "He is right," she said. "It is one of the more useful things about you." She went inside. He followed, after a moment, and Chambers materialized from the hallway with a coat and the expression of a man who has heard nothing and seen nothing, and is entirely unconcerned about the temperature, and the house settled around them in the quiet way of a house that has learned to trust its occupants. Spring came to Derbyshire in slow steps, and with it came the matter of Godfrey. Lawrence had gathered what he needed over the preceding months. The investigation had been careful and thorough, conducted through Chambers and through the London solicitors at Pembroke and Aldgate, who proved, once their loyalty was confirmed, to be both competent and outraged on their client's behalf. The picture that emerged was of a man who had spent 3 years diverting a modest but consistent percentage of estate rental income into accounts that were not the estate's, falsifying maintenance records to explain the missing sums, and using his position as an intermediary between the estate and its tenants to operate a secondary scheme of his own devising. The amounts, accumulated across 3 years, were not negligible. Lawrence laid the evidence before Godfrey in the estate office on a Thursday morning in April. He did it himself, not through lawyers, not through Chambers, though Chambers was present as a witness. He sat across from Godfrey with the account books open between them and went through them item by item, out in the quiet and methodical way of a man who has learned to conduct difficult conversations without raising his voice. Godfrey's composure deteriorated at approximately the 3rd ledger. "You were the beggar," he said, when the silence had gone on long enough. "I was," Lawrence said. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." Godfrey looked at the account books for a moment. Then he said, "What do you intend to do?" "Prosecute," Lawrence said. "The matter will go to the magistrate at Ashford. I have engaged counsel. The hearing will be in June." He paused. "I should tell you that a full confession and immediate restitution of all funds would be taken into account. I should also tell you that I intend to proceed regardless." Godfrey said nothing further. He looked like a man who had known, somewhere beneath the running of his various schemes, that this day would come, and who was finding it both worse and somehow less surprising than he had feared. He was charged in May. The trial proceeded in June. The accounts were clear, the evidence thorough, and the counsel on both sides competent, though one had considerably better material to work with than the other. Godfrey was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 3 years' imprisonment and a requirement of full financial restitution. The estate recovered the diverted funds, with interest, within the following 12 months. The matter of Lady Millicent was different in kind. There was no criminal fraud to prosecute. What Lady Millicent had done, arranged a marriage for her stepdaughter under legal guardianship with the father's consent, was entirely within the law as it stood in 1883. The Married Women's Property Act had changed certain things, but it had not changed this. A woman's guardian could arrange her marriage. The law permitted it. The law had permitted it for centuries. This fact enraged Winifred at a level that was, she noted to herself, extremely useful educationally. She wrote it into her correspondence with Lincoln's Inn. She worked it into a memorandum she composed on the legal position of female minors under the guardianship laws, which she shared with a barrister's wife she had come to know through Augusta's social connections, who shared it with her husband, who read it with interest and said that whoever had written it had a very clear mind. "My daughter-in-law," Augusta said. "She is studying law." "That is not currently possible for a woman," the barrister said. "No," Augusta agreed. "Not yet." Lady Millicent's reckoning came not from law, but from society, which is sometimes a slower and more thorough instrument. The news that the crippled beggar of St. Aldwyn's Church was in fact the Duke of Blackmere reached London society in the way that all such extraordinary news reaches it, in pieces through a dozen different channels, gathering detail and embellishment at each pass. By the time the full version had circulated, it was known that Lady Millicent Shepherd had sold her stepdaughter to a duke in disguise under the impression that she was disposing of her to a pauper, and had done so deliberately and with great satisfaction. London society has many vices, but it has one consistency. It does not forgive the person who has been caught looking foolish. Lady Millicent's invitations began to thin in the late spring. By summer, they had all but stopped. The drawing rooms that had previously welcomed her closed one by one, not dramatically, not with any explicit statement of censure, but in the quiet, ruthless way of doors that simply stop being answered. Her social credit, built across years of careful cultivation, dissolved with remarkable speed. She wrote to Winifred once, a letter of 3 pages that oscillated between accusation and something that, in a woman of less brass, might have resembled an apology. She described herself as having been misled, as having acted in Winifred's best interests, as having been a victim of Godfrey's deception. Winifred read the letter carefully. She set it in the correspondence file under L, for Lady Millicent, not for legitimate grievance, and did not reply. She had considered replying. She had drafted 2 responses and discarded both because she found, examining them, that she did not wish to be the kind of person whose victory required her to explain it to the person who had tried to defeat her. It was sufficient that the thing was as it was. She closed the file and returned to her work. Benjamin Shepherd came to Blackmere in July. He arrived without announcement by the morning coach from Derby and was admitted to the house on Chambers' authority after a brief conversation on the doorstep. Lawrence was in the estate office. Winifred was in the library. She heard the bell and then footsteps, and then Lara appeared at the library door with an expression that conveyed a great deal in a small space. "Your father, ma'am," Lara said. "Yes," Winifred said. "Show him in." Benjamin Shepherd had aged. He had always been a slight man, but he was slighter now, as though the months since October had reduced him further by some invisible process. He held his hat in both hands and looked at his daughter across the library, and his face had the expression of a man who has prepared what he means to say, and has discovered, in the moment of saying it, that the words are entirely inadequate. "Winifred," he said. "Father," she said. He sat down in the chair she indicated, which was the reading chair she used herself, though she did not tell him that. "I did not know," he said. "Oh, about the Duke?" "No," she said. "I know you did not." "But I knew about Millicent's purpose," he said. It came out quietly, without cushioning. "I knew she wished to be rid of you. I allowed it. I told myself it was for your benefit, that you would be provided for. I told myself that for several months, and it became easier to believe as time went on." He looked at his hat. "It was not true." Winifred said nothing for a moment. "No," she said, "it was not." "I am sorry," he said. "I know that is an insufficient." "It is," she said, "but I accept it." He looked up. "I accept it," she said again, "because refusing it would require me to carry it indefinitely, and I have a great deal of other work to do." She looked at him steadily. "I am studying law. I am writing to Lincoln's Inn. But I am compiling a memorandum on the legal position of women under guardianship that I intend to present, in one form or another, to every person in a position to do something about it, until someone does something about it. I do not have time to be angry with you for the rest of my life." She paused. "But I should like you to know what it was, what you permitted, not the version you told yourself." "Yes," he said, "I know it." "Good," she said. She poured him tea. He stayed for the afternoon. He met Lawrence at dinner and conducted himself with the uncomfortable but genuine courtesy of a man who is aware that he has no grounds for any other attitude. Lawrence was civil and direct and offered no false warmth, but also no cruelty. Benjamin returned to London the following morning. He wrote to Winifred regularly after that. She replied. The correspondence was careful and did not venture into very deep water, but it was consistent, and consistency in her experience was worth considerably more than warmth that came and went. He never returned to Carrow Street. He let the house and took rooms in Bloomsbury, and Lady Millicent's subsequent whereabouts were not, for the most part, his concern or anyone else's who mattered. The summer of 1884 was warm and long, and Blackmere in full summer was a different house from the one Winifred had arrived at in October. The gardens came into themselves, the valley turned deep green, the windows stood open in the evenings, and the air moved through the library, carrying the smell of cut grass and something she could not name precisely, but that she later identified, tentatively, as contentment. She had not been content before, but not in any sustained way. She had been functional, and she had been determined, and she had been, underneath both of those things, quietly and persistently unhappy in the manner of a person who has grown so accustomed to managing a condition that they have forgotten it is a condition at all. It crept up on her, contentment. She did not notice it arriving. She noticed it one evening in June, when she looked up from a particularly dense section of Anson on contract, and realized that she had been in the library for 4 hours, and had not once, in those 4 hours, thought about Lady Millicent or the house on Carrow Street or the cold stone steps of St. Aldwyn's Church. She had been thinking about contract law, and also, intermittently, about Lawrence, but that was a separate matter. The matter of Lawrence, as she referred to it privately, but resolved itself in the gradual way that honest things resolve, without dramatic declaration, without the sharp climactic moment that novels tend to supply, but as the steady accumulation of small evidence that something has changed. He read aloud to her on Tuesday evenings, not from legal texts, she had plenty of legal texts, but from other things, history, Poetry, a chapter of natural philosophy that had particularly amused him. A letter from a friend in Edinburgh about a new approach to mathematics that he thought she would find interesting, and that she found, indeed, interesting. He had a good reading voice. She told him so once, and he looked both pleased and slightly surprised, which she found endearing in a man who was not, in other respects, easily disconcerted. She began to bring him things in return. A passage from a history she was reading, an argument she was working through and wanted to test aloud. Once, memorably, a poem she had copied out in her own hand from a volume she had found behind the law texts. A small, old, anonymous thing about a woman standing at a window watching a storm, and which she had left on his desk without comment. He did not comment on it directly, but the next Tuesday he read, among other things, 3 poems she had not heard before, which he had evidently sought out and prepared, and when he finished the 3rd one, he looked at her over the book, and his expression was entirely unguarded for a moment. No armor, no careful composure, and she thought, oh. She had known people her whole life who spoke of love as though it were a sudden thing, a lightning strike, an arrival. But what she felt, looking at him in the lamplight of the Tuesday evening library, with the summer dark outside the windows, was something that had clearly been building for a very long time without her having had the wherewithal to name it. She did not say it that evening. She said it in August, on the terrace, at the end of a very ordinary day that had included a disagreement about statutory interpretation, a walk through the lower gardens, and a long and rather fine dinner, during which Augusta had told an extremely funny story about a house party in 1857, and neither of them had been able to stop laughing for several minutes. "I love you," she said. Not dramatically, as a statement of established fact. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I have been waiting for you to be ready to say so." "You knew," she said. "I have read Blackstone," he said. "Volume 1. I am generally good at evidence." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I love you, and I also intend to be called to the bar, which I am aware will be legally impossible for some time yet, but which will not remain legally impossible indefinitely." "Winifred," he said. "Yes?" "I did not marry you because I expected you to be convenient." She thought about that for a moment. The valley below was dark and enormous and very quiet, and the stars were fully out. "No," she said, "I don't suppose you did." The years that followed were not simple. They were good and full, and difficult in the ways that good and full years tend to be difficult, and Winifred worked at her law with the same steady determination she had applied to everything since the age of 12. In 1888, she submitted a formal memorandum to the Select Committee on Law Reform concerning the legal status of married women under the Married Women's Property Act, arguing for strengthened protections and clearer statutory language. The memorandum was entered into the record. Her name was on it. In 1891, she contributed a chapter to a collection of essays on legal reform compiled by a society of which she had become a founding member, a society of women and sympathetic men dedicated to the reform of the laws governing women's legal standing. The chapter was on guardianship law. It cited her own case anonymized as an illustrative instance of the failures of the existing statutory framework. In 1893, she was introduced at a formal dinner in London to a barrister named Aldgate, the junior partner of Pembroke and Aldgate, who had read her chapter and said over the soup course that it was the most precise piece of legal reasoning he had encountered from outside the bar. "I intend to be inside it," Winifred said. "Women cannot currently be called," he said. "Not currently," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Or if and when the law changes, would you be willing to read in my chambers?" She considered him. She considered the offer. She said, "Yes, I would," She wrote to Lawrence that night from the London house. The letter was 1 page and contained a great deal of technical information about the conversation and its implications, and ended without preamble. I believe we are making progress. Give my love to Augusta. Come to London next week. I want to show you something. He came. She showed him the correspondence file she had kept since 1884. 9 years of letters to Lincoln's Inn, all unanswered, all dated, all filed in order. She spread them on the desk in the London study. He looked at them for a long time. 9 years, he said. Thus far, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. And he smiled. Fully, but not the careful, almost smile of a man who has learned to manage his expressions, but a real and wide and entirely unguarded smile. And she thought, not for the first time, and not for the last, that this man, whom she had first seen on a street corner reading Blackstone in a patched coat and a tin cup, was the person she would have chosen above any other to stand beside her at whatever window she happened to be looking out of. The Women's Law Society held its annual address in a hall in Gray's Inn Road in the autumn of 1903, and among those seated at the front were several women whose names had become, over the preceding decade, a familiar presence in the correspondence rooms of legal reform organizations across England and Scotland. The speaker that evening was a woman of 43, as in a dark blue evening coat, with her dark hair pinned simply, and her mother's cameo at her collar. She stood at the lectern and looked out at the room, at the women of various ages and situations who had gathered, at the handful of sympathetic barristers and legal scholars who had come, at Lara Lloyd, seated in the 3rd row, who had been there from the beginning, and who was now the Society's administrative secretary, and she said, "When I was 12 years old, I found a volume of Blackstone in my grandfather's library, and hid it under my mattress because I was not supposed to have it. I had it for 11 years before anyone discovered that I had been reading it. And the person who discovered it was not the person you might expect, and he did not take it away." A murmur of laughter from the room. "I have been asked, 'twas on various occasions, what it was that made me certain that the law could be reformed, that it would, eventually, be forced to accommodate the people it had spent centuries pretending were not there." She paused. "The answer is that I was not always certain. There were years when the correspondence file felt like a document of failure, letter after letter with no reply, or a polite letter of refusal, which is only slightly preferable to silence. There were years when the scale of what needed to change seemed too large and too deeply embedded to be moved by any individual effort." She looked at the room. "But I had read Blackstone. I knew that the law is not a fixed thing. It has never been a fixed thing. It has been argued into shape by the people who engaged with it, seriously, consistently, and without giving up. But every statute that now protects a woman's right to hold property, to retain her own wages, to exist as a legal person with standing, every one of those was argued into existence by someone who sat down one morning and wrote a letter that nobody answered, and then wrote another and another until someone finally had to answer." Silence in the room. The good kind. "We are not finished," she said. "We are perhaps 1/3 finished, which is not nothing and is not enough. But I have been 1/3 of the way finished before, and I found the best approach was to begin on the 2nd third." More laughter. Warmer this time. She looked toward the back of the room, where Lawrence Pembroke, His Grace the Duke of Blackmere, had stood against the wall with his hands in his coat pockets, and the expression of a man who is watching someone he loves do exactly what they were born to do. She looked at him for a moment. He inclined his head, very slightly. She looked back at the room. "Let us," she said, "get back to work." What became of them all? Lady Millicent Shepherd. Socially ruined by the revelation of her scheme, Lady Millicent spent her middle years in a succession of smaller houses and reduced circumstances. She retained her title, but not the company that had once given it value. She outlived most of the people who had witnessed her humiliation and died in 1907 in a rented house in Bath, with no record of anyone having much mourned her. The house on Carrow Street passed eventually, as to Winifred, under a provision of Benjamin Shepherd's will, and she sold it without sentiment and directed the proceeds to the Women's Law Society. Benjamin Shepherd. He spent his later years in his Bloomsbury rooms and corresponded regularly with his daughter. He was never entirely forgiven and never entirely unforgiven. He occupied that intermediate territory of a man who knows he failed and knows that is the right outcome of knowing it. He died in 1896 and left his personal effects and a modest legacy to Winifred. She received them without ceremony and kept a photograph of him on the desk in the library at Blackmere. Godfrey. He served his 3 years and was released in 1888. He left England shortly thereafter and was heard of subsequently, by rumour only, in Cape Colony. He did not return. The money was repaid in full. Charles Chambers. He remained at Blackmere for the rest of his working life and retired in 1910 at the age of 68, with a pension and a set of rooms in the village below the estate. He was, by common agreement, the most dependable person in the county, and possibly the most discreet. He never spoke publicly about the Millhaven Lane episode. He did not need to. Lara Lloyd. She became administrative secretary of the Women's Law Society in 1895 and held the position for 22 years. She was also, by 1900, publishing under her own name, short articles on the legal position of working women, in a reform journal of moderate circulation. She never married, which she described on one occasion as a professional decision, and retired from the society in 1917 with a presentation and a speech that made most of the room cry, which she had not intended and which she regarded with evident horror. Catherine. She came to Blackmere in 1884 and served Winifred personally for 12 years and was thereafter, at Winifred's insistence and over Winifred's continued involvement in the administration of the arrangement, elevated to housekeeper of the London house, a position that suited her practical capabilities exactly. She left warm cups of tea outside Winifred's door for the rest of their time in the same household, because some things are more important than hierarchy. Augusta Pembroke. She lived to see her daughter-in-law speak at the 1903 Women's Law Society address, and afterwards said only, "I told Lawrence the stratagem was foolish, and that it would work out all right anyway. Well, I was correct on both counts." She died in 1906 at the age of 83, and was widely regarded in her later years as one of the more formidable women in Derbyshire society, which was itself a region not short of formidable women. Lawrence Pembroke, His Grace the Duke of Blackmere. He managed Blackmere with care and intelligence and a degree of fairness toward his tenants that was remarked upon by contemporaries as unusual for the period, and that he regarded as simply obvious. He supported Winifred's legal work in every practical way available to him, which included, in 1905, endowing a small library of legal texts at a women's educational institution in London in Eleanor Shepherd's name, Winifred's mother, whose portrait hung in the Blackmere Library between a window and a shelf of Blackstone. He was also, by all accounts, a man of considerable personal happiness, which he wore quietly and without advertisement. Winifred Shepherd Pembroke, Duchess of Blackmere. She was called to the bar in 1922, following the Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919, which finally removed the statutory barrier that had kept women from the legal profession for centuries. She was 62 years old. The letter she wrote to Lincoln's Inn that morning, The last in a correspondence that had begun in 1884, 38 years earlier, was 3 sentences long. She framed it and hung it above her desk. The case she took on first was a guardianship matter. A young woman of 20, a step-parent with a document. She won it. If Winifred's story stayed with you, if her endurance, her quiet fire, Monsieur Lawrence's hidden truth moved something in you, then you are exactly the audience this story was written for. Subscribe and press that bell. Comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from. I will read every single one, and I will say hello to you. Because the further this story travels, the more I want to know how far our story is going together. Thank you. Some stories are not told with trumpets. They are told with the scratch of a pen in a cold morning room, with a legal text hidden under a mattress, with a letter written and sent into silence, and written again. They are told in the slow accumulation of days that feel, each one, like insufficient progress, and that add up across a lifetime to something that could not have been built any other way. Well, Winifred Shepherd began with nothing that the world recognized as power. No title, no income, no legal standing, no voice that the law of England in 1883 was required to hear. She had books under a mattress, a sharp mind, and the particular quality of endurance that belongs to people who have learned to hold themselves upright in conditions that were designed to make them fold. That was enough. It was more than enough. The Victorian period produced extraordinary constraints on women's lives, constraints that were codified in law, enforced by custom, and defended by people who benefited from them. It also produced the women who dismantled those constraints, one letter, one memorandum, one argument at a time. Women whose names we do not always know, who sat at desks in rooms they were not supposed to occupy, and wrote things that the world was not yet ready to hear, and kept writing until it was. This story was written in their spirit. If it reminded you that patience is not weakness, that intelligence needs only an opening to make itself known, and that the person someone underestimates is quite often the most dangerous person in the room, then it has done exactly what a story is supposed to do. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for understanding that stories told with care and with respect for their subject deserve to be received with the same. We shall return soon with another Victorian tale of hidden truths and quiet consequence. Until then, keep reading. Keep asking questions. Keep the black stone where you can find it. Thank you.